Okay, I think I'll get started now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ingrid Cigaretta. I'm the Academic Success Manager from 10,000 Degrees. Thank you again for joining us. On behalf of myself and the team, we are so happy that you are here for this very informative and important training that we are offering today. As you know, in December, we queried our volunteers to find out what they felt they needed the most support with, what they wanted to learn more about. And by and large, working with English language learners and emergent bilingual students was one of the most popular things that everyone wanted more support on. So we listened, and not only did we listen, but we got the best of the best here today to share her wisdom, her insight, and just give you great tips on supporting the students that you work with every day. Before I continue, I just wanted to let you all know that we are recording this presentation for volunteers who were not able to attend, so that they can watch it, and that so that we can share this throughout the many years that we hope you'll be volunteering with us, and always have this as a resource to you. And also, I want to remind you that we will have time for you to ask questions after Cecilia's presentation. You are also welcomed to add any questions in our chat, and then Cecilia will answer them. And of course, if you think of something even after the presentation, you're welcome to reach out to any of us and let us know, and we'd be happy to address that. So a little bit about our host, Cecilia Quintana-Pérez, my dear friend, started her journey in education working at Bahia Vista Elementary School as a teacher for many years. And then she moved on to Benicia Valley, where she was an instructional coach. Then she returned to Bahia Vista as principal for many years, and I had the great pleasure of working with her there. And now she is the director of multilingual learner programs for San Rafael City Schools. Cecilia, we are so honored to have you here today. We thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for this opportunity that you are giving us. I'm, grateful to have you here, and even more proud to call you my friend. So I guess without further ado, why don't you go on and do your thing.
All right. Well, thank you, Ingrid. That's so sweet. It is absolutely a pleasure. It's tickling for me to hear that this was such an area of interest for everybody, and the very important work that you do to support our students. And of course, when Ingrid reached out, I said, of course, I would do anything for Ingrid, but also the 10,000 Degrees, the volunteer program is such a critical piece of the work we do in our districts across the county. And your work, it does not go unnoticed. As a classroom teacher for 16 years, I benefited greatly from many volunteers over the years, some of whom I still keep in close contact with. And as a principal, we really kind of folded our volunteers into our overall intervention piece when we knew there were students that needed particular support or just a little extra cheerleader on the side helping them. So thank you for what you do and for taking the time out of your busy days to be here. So I'm going to go into full screen in just a minute, but if you have questions along the way, you can pop them into the chat. There will be time at the end of the presentation to ask some questions. And then before we fully get started, I did want to recognize a very important volunteer who also is a beloved colleague and friend and my former boss, Dr. Mayra Perez. She is an amazing instructional leader. She is so dedicated to this work. I learned so much under her wing. We were all heartbroken when she moved on to her next step in her career here in San Rafael. But Mayra, thank you so much for being here, and feel free to jump in anytime because this is kind of like the person, the apprentice trying to deliver to the mentor. So
An
feel
amazing apprentice. I don't think I have to say a word.
all right, well, let's move into this. All right, get past that screen. So when we're working with students as a classroom teacher, and even in a small setting as a volunteer, it's always nice to let students know exactly what are the goals of your time with them for any given day or for any given lesson. So for today, we kind of have 3 overarching objectives to give you kind of a brief overview of the stages of language development so that you can apply that to the students you're working with. As you know, in our county, we are so fortunate to have students that have, were born here and speak very fluent English and maybe just need some additional support for academics. We have students that are still developing their English language skills, that were born here but they still have not been reclassified. And then we have students who are recently arrived to our country. So we run a wide spectrum of English learners that we serve. So we'll learn a little bit about language development, talk about academic vocabulary and its importance in the work that we do, and how we can really leverage academic vocabulary to support language development. And then we'll talk about some specific strategies that you might want to weave into your work with our students. And before we get started, I just wanted to build a little context. Education is like any other profession, any other industry. We have a lot of acronyms. So I wanted to put in perspective kind of where we are now in terms of how we speak about the language we use, the acronyms we use to mean our English language learners, because you may see these acronyms and hear these acronyms used interchangeably. So basically, this is showing federal policy. There are federal mandates, rules, guidelines. The language at the federal level has changed over the years. When I first started teaching in 1997, we referred to students as LEPs, NEPs, and FEPs, non-English proficient, limited English proficient, and fluent English proficient. A few years later, that terminology changed, and what was used more broadly was ELL, English Language Learners. That term is still used in several states. And then we kind of minimize that a little bit, and we just used ELs to be English Learners. We still use EL a lot. I will say EL a lot. When I'm doing a report about federal funding related to English learners, I will say English learners because it's kind of a language of compliance. But a wonderful thing happened in kind of the early 2000s, the mid 2000s. And I remember when Myra came to our district, she really was supporting us in shifting our mindset and shifting the language we use to talk about our language learners. And that is emergent bilingual. So rather than from the lens that there's a deficit, that students don't know English and they need to learn English, we have students who actually come to us with a complex language system in their first language, and now they're learning to be English on top of it. So they will be truly bilingual students once they, become fluent in the English language. So that's, I will use Emergent Bilingual throughout the presentation. You'll see it on some of the slides. And now we're kind of taking it a step further, which is wonderful, and using the term multilingual learners to really encompass the broad range of learners that we have. And that could even include a native English speaker who has taken maybe 3 or 4 years of a second language, be it French or Spanish, in high school, and now will be graduating with a seal of biliteracy, which is something our state recognizes and that we participate in. So just to lay some groundwork, don't get too caught up on the acronyms, but if you get confused, here's a slide for your reference. So let's talk a little bit about language development and the different stages of language development. I wanted to ground us just in this very simple idea that the way we learn language is by using it a lot in different settings, in different ways, with different people, with different audiences. And the work with our emergent bilingual students, our multilingual students, really should be centered around acquiring a language and a language system in the most meaningful and authentic way versus learning a language through rote routine and kind of the drill and kill method that we used to talk about in education 20 years ago. So really, every single opportunity, every minute you have working with your students is an opportunity to support their language acquisition. And some days it may look like working through a worksheet that a teacher maybe, has assigned to them. But every opportunity you have to point out language features, vocabulary, take those opportunities to really think of that whole child and that language acquisition that we really want our students to master. And we want to see it across all content areas. So for those of you working with middle and high school students, it's very different than in the elementary world. They have multiple teachers, multiple classes, multiple subject areas, but a science teacher, a math teacher, a history, social studies teacher is just as much a language teacher as an English or ELD, English language development teacher. So that's a very, very important thing to hold on to. We have multiple opportunities every day to support English language development. Real briefly, there are 4 domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In order to be fluent, academically fluent in English, students need to master all 4 domains. In fact, they're assessed if a student has not been reclassified yet and is an English learner. They are assessed every year on an assessment called the LPAC assessment. You may have been, it's happening now in schools, so you may be in settings where students are taking this assessment in their classes, or testers are coming to the school to assess the students. And this is basically the state's formal assessment to see how students are progressing in their English language development. Now, of these 4 domains, listening and reading is really the receptive language, what we take in, what we process, what we hear, what we see in print. And then on the other end is expressive language, and that's composed of the speaking and writing domain. That is what we produce, what we say, what we write, how we express our language. In terms of the stages of second language acquisition, it's for an English learner, it's very similar to a young child when they're learning language. In the early stages of English language acquisition, students are in what we call a pre-productive mode. We, in education, we say a lot, the students are in a silent period, which means they are taking in a lot. Their receptive language is building and building and building, but they're just not there yet developmentally to express what they might want to say or what they might want to write or communicate. When we receive newcomers in our schools, and we do receive a lot of newcomers in Marin County, it's very common for the students just to kind of watch, pay attention to the routines, take verbal cues, take visual cues, but not really say a lot. And that's totally normal. We want to make sure that we are continuing to speak to the child, recognize the child, and have them participate in ways that is not solely dependent on speaking, because they're just not ready yet. Once they've got some more vocabulary and they've got some, what we say, maybe survival English, we call that early production. That's the second stage of language acquisition. And that could be asking to go to the restroom or asking a friend to borrow a pencil. So those are kind of normal, like I said, we call it survival English that you need to get through a given day in a classroom and in a school setting. And when students really start to produce the language, we know that they're what we call an affective filter. It's a term we use. It's basically they're feeling a little more comfort and confidence in being able to produce the language and start to play around the language, right? Classrooms and schoolyards are like a playground for learning language. And we want to set up those environments so that students feel safe and they feel included and they feel that it's okay to try and try out this new language that they're learning. Once they get kind of past those basic words and phrases, they do start to emerge in their speech more. This is where they use more frequently used words. Sometimes it might not be a full complete sentence, but they're using longer phrases. Their vocabulary is coming somewhat more diverse and varied. and they're starting to understand what's kind of the appropriate language of an appropriate setting. For example, if I'm at home and I'm talking to my husband or my son or my parent, it's very different than the way I might be talking to you right now, because right now I'm giving a formal presentation. So students also learn that. What's the language we speak among our peers and our friends, as opposed to how do we interact with our classroom teachers, our classroom volunteers, the adults in our setting. So that's part of when that emergent speech, it's not just the words they're saying, it's who and how they're speaking to. And then they become more fluent. So the next three phases are beginning fluency, intermediate fluency, and advanced fluency. And just note, this is oral language fluency, not reading fluency, because we talk a lot about reading and writing fluency and math fluency. This is oral language fluency, being able to speak and utilize and kind of negotiate language in a way that demonstrates that students are progressing. So in the beginning fluency stage, students can more or less get along in kind of a social situation. They're not making as much errors. Their syntax is beginning to improve. They're able to apply new vocabulary within the context of words and phrases they've already learned. Intermediate fluency is just kind of that next level up. They get even more confident in speaking in social settings and adjusting their register as needed, depending on the audience they're speaking to. If they need to give an oral presentation in their class, intermediate fluency would be able to do more or less a full kind of presentation with the kind of language we would expect to see, vocabulary, sentence structure, grammatical structures. And then advanced fluency is really speaking almost close to what a native English speaker, how a native English speaker would speak, right? We learn language, we just absorb it from the moment we're born. And if that language that you've been absorbing for your first 5 years of life hasn't been English, and then you're in an English language setting, it takes time, right? So advanced fluency really is the level where a student, an English learner, is speaking more or less at the level of a native English speaker. All right. And I'm sure you see this every day with the students you're working with. English is a really hard language. It is not an easy language to learn. And we're going to do a quick comparison on some common languages. So let's look first at Italian. I don't know if we have any Italian speakers out in the group today, but Italian is a language with 33 phonemes and 25 different ways to combine letters and sounds to spell words. A phoneme is just an individual sound, an individual A, E, I, O, U, B, sh, t. That's just a phoneme. It's one single sound, and we string those sounds together to create words, and we string those words together to create sentences. So Italian, 33 phonemes. Spanish, 35 phonemes and 38 different ways to spell a word. Spanish is a beautiful language in that there aren't words that don't look exactly the way they sound. If I say a word in Spanish, I'm going to write it the exact way it sounds. The vowels don't change, they stay the same. We don't put two vowels together and get everything all confused. Spanish is a language much like Italian that I won't say it's easy to learn, but it's a lot easier to read and write in Spanish, if that's your first language, than learning how to read or write in English, because English, we have all these crazy rules. French, same. French only has 32 phonemes, but they do have a lot of combinations to spell words. English, 44 phonemes, 44 distinct individual sounds, and 1,100, more than 1,100 ways to spell those sounds. Now, it wasn't until I was an adult and I taught English as a second language to adults that really made sense to me, because I couldn't explain why certain words were spelled the way they were spelled. I just learned them. I didn't really learn the rules. A word like cough, for example, if I'm using my sounds, K-O-F, cough, it makes sense. No, it's a Kough. How do you explain that? I don't know. I couldn't explain it. It's just something I memorized. So when we're working with our students, especially our young students who are just now learning to read, there are a lot of rules and patterns they need to learn while they're also learning the English language. So it's really double work for them. Here's a quick chart just to give you an example of those phonemes, all the different sounds that exist in the English language, but that's just the sounds. When it comes to actually writing a word or reading a word, it's a lot more difficult. For example, let's take the long I sound, right? Here are 6 different ways to represent the long I sound. Silent, just an I. Kite has the I and that silent E at the end that makes I say its name. Night, Night. Where did that come from? But it also says long I. My, Y. Type, Y with a silent E. And pie, P-I-E. I mean, it's a lot to teach a student. So if you're trying to read and write using these letters, and maybe you don't even know what some of these words mean. I mean, pie, right? We know it's a pie, apple pie. Tomorrow's March 14th, it's Pie Day. Now, if you're a native Spanish speaker and you may have some literacy in Spanish, you might read that word as pie, which means foot in Spanish. So there is so much to negotiate in learning a language and learning all of the rules of that language. Just something to keep in mind when you're working with students, that these are very specific, explicit skills that need to be taught and discussed, and of course, practiced and applied. And something really important to remember is research has shown time and time again that in order to become fluently proficient at academic English, it's about a 5 to 7 year process. So if you think about your students in the young grades, your English learners in the younger grades, they're just now starting on their academic trajectory and their English language acquisition trajectory. We wouldn't expect a kindergartner, first or second grade English learner to be fluent in English yet because they're still learning. Same would apply to a newcomer. In our district in San Rafael, we receive a lot of newcomers at the middle and high school level who, even though they're 12, 14, 16 years old, they might be they're at the very beginning of learning English. So it's possible that by the end of high school they might not still be fully proficient, but what we want to do is make sure that they're making progress towards proficiency. But big picture, language takes a very long time to learn, and that's when it's being used on a regular basis in different settings, and that's academic English. This is what we look for, because the difference is, we're going to move into academic vocabulary now. We like to look at kind of the informal language, or the language of the playground, the language of our friends, and then formal language. So if you look on one side of the column, you'll see our basic communication skills, informal language. I'm talking to a friend about a movie we saw. We're talking about maybe a trip we want to take. I'm talking to my mom, sharing about my day. Mainly oral language skills. Tier 1 words, which we're going to cover real quickly in just a minute, usually contextualized. There's an experience, there's a picture, there's something you can kind of grab onto to get an image of what you're talking about in these basic communication settings. And you pick up a lot of that language just through social interactions. We have a lot of students that sound really great in English because they, in fact, have really strong communication skills. You can have a conversation with them, and then if you work with them and you're trying to apply that work to reading, even though they may be really strong English speakers, they're still developing their academic English language. So in order to really do the schoolwork that's required of them, we need to focus a lot on academic language proficiency, which is more formal. It's much more abstract. Sometimes think about if you're working with a student who's reading a chapter book or a passage, it's not like a picture book, right? You have to be able to read the words, make connections of those words to your own world, to experiences you've had, to things you've learned previously. academic language, or which is we call tier 2 and tier 3 words, that is the language of school. That's the language of classroom. That's the language of textbooks. That's the language of assessments. So we spend a lot of time in our teacher training talking about the importance of being very explicit in teaching academic language, modeling academic language, and giving students as many opportunities as possible to practice their academic language and to apply it. It's a lot more higher stakes to use this language, but it needs to be developed with our students. And this academic language proficiency takes a little bit longer. It's about 5 to 10 years to really develop. We're going to talk a little bit about academic language because I want to drive home a point just about the different tiers of vocabulary and hopefully connect it to the work that you do. So in vocabulary development, we like to think of 3 tiers of vocabulary. First tier are really those basic familiar words. Tier 2 are words that we use very frequently, and tier 3 are really specialized vocabulary. And I have some slides here that describe it even further. The tier 1 vocabulary, really basic words that we hear almost every day, words like baby, sad, clock, bus, door, eat, play. Those are tier 1 vocabulary words that are used often. You pretty much can't go through a given day without using these kind of basic words that students learn really fast. Tier 2 vocabulary words, these are words that are used really frequently in the academic setting, in a classroom, in a textbook, in an assessment, in any kind of academic task that's asked of students. It is just riddled with tier 2 vocabulary. And there's some examples here on the screen. One of the examples that I like to give is transition words, for example. Frequently, afterwards, words like eventually. Those are kind of words that are tier 2 vocabulary words that if you don't understand that word and what it means, it can completely change the meaning of a passage, a story, or a piece of work that a student might be producing. So tier 2 vocabulary, we call, that's the language of a textbook. And that language we really need to focus on a lot with our students. And a lot of times these words have multiple meanings. The word table, for example, it could be a table we put our food on to eat. It could be a periodic table of elements. It could be a mathematical table that we're putting a graph on, doing some visual thinking on. So those are words that specifically need to be taught to students. And then the tier 3 vocabulary, that's really a specialized vocabulary. They're not used as often. And these are really content specific. So if you're doing a unit or you're studying photosynthesis, you would learn chlorophyll, photosynthesis. You would learn these words. We're not going to say those words every day though, right? I'm learning about this right now. So I want to know what photosynthesis is. It's going to help me understand a process that I need to learn about as part of my science instruction, but it's not a word I'm going to use every day in my life. Think about the last time you used the word photosynthesis. It was probably a while ago. And I mean, unless you're, a botanist or a gardener, maybe you're using it more often. So given what I just said, and I know we've covered a lot, I want you to think about pop quiz. We do this to students, right? We shouldn't do it, but we do. We just give them a quick, okay, were you listening? Were you paying attention? Which tier of vocabulary do you think we should focus on the most when we're working with our emergent bilingual students? Tier 1 words, tier 2 words, and tier 3 words. And I'm going to say right now, the way I've just explained this, and now I'm giving you a quiz, I would never do that to a student or to a class. We would spend a lot of time talking about it, have students talk about it, have conversations about it, but you're all adults. So we're going to say, which tier should we focus the most on? And you can answer in the chat. Which one do we leverage? You think you're going to get the most results from your students from tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And you can enter A, B, C in the chat box. And we'll give you 30 seconds. How's that sound? Make it a little engaging here. I'm not looking in the chat here, but drum roll. Let's see if you got it right. If you chose B, you are correct. You're halfway to getting a teaching credential. That's amazing if you chose B. If you chose A or C, that's okay too. We can review this at a later date. All the tiers are important, but tier 2 is really important. A student cannot get through a reading passage without understanding those tier 2 words. A student cannot write a complex piece of writing or even a simple paragraph for that matter without understanding transition words or sequencing language. These are words that we need to really focus on. So if you're working with a student and say you are working through a passage, you would absolutely want to focus on some of the core content words that are there, right? If you're learning about states of matter, right? You would want to make sure we understand what a liquid is, gas, solid, but really the focus in terms of language development should be on all the words around it that make it make sense so that students can actually take that knowledge and build a schema in their mind of how to apply language. So bravo if you chose tier 2, you get a gold star for the day. All right. Now, kind of build some common knowledge, some common background. I do want to spend some time talking about some specific moves, intentional, we call them instructional moves or strategies that you can make for the English learners you're working with. So we use this term often, and this is a visual you use often. We call it instructional scaffolding. So much like when a building is being built, instructional scaffolds are really meant to give students temporary supports that they might need in order to access the content and to access the language. And we're going to talk about what those look like in just a minute. But just as much as a scaffold in a building, gradually we remove those scaffolds. And this is really an art. The timing, there's never like a set time, oh, we're going to pull that scaffold away. This really comes from a careful, thoughtful, observational eye of a teacher or a volunteer that's working with a student that thinks, I think they might be ready to try this without a picture, or to try this without me giving them a sentence start or some additional language. Similar to if you've raised children, when is it time to maybe let's try taking those training wheels off the bike and see how they do. And no, we better put those training wheels back on for a few more weeks, practice some more, or wow, they can do this without the training wheels now. Scaffolding in our instruction is exactly the same. And we like to think about scaffolds in these kind of 3 buckets that are super effective for English learners, which is sensory, interactive, and graphic. And here I did not create this. I borrowed this from an amazing blogger and researcher on English language learners. But some examples of sensory scaffolds might be providing illustrations and pictures when you're working with students to help some of that vocabulary come to life, or to help students connect their learning to things they might more easily understand. A lot of manipulatives or hands-on objects that we have them use. We see that a lot in math classes, right? We have physical things that students can move around to create patterns, to count, diagrams, drawings, pictures, physically moving. So we do this a lot. If you work with small kids and you've seen the teachers do it, you see them, a kindergartner has about a 5-minute attention span, totally developmentally appropriate. That's what we would expect. So, after 5-7 minutes, you start to see kids tip over a little bit in their seats or lay down on the rug because they need some physical movement. They need a quick little brain break. So you see teachers in the primary grades really standing up a lot, counting with their bodies, doing movement when they recite the alphabet or the letter sounds. Sensory, anytime you can incorporate that into your work with students, it is really going to help them develop their language skills and make those connections. We need to bring language learning to life for our students, for our English learners. Interactive, now depending if you're doing one-on-one tutoring or small groups, it's always good to have the students kind of support the learning amongst each other. So if you have the advantage of working with 2 or 3 students at the same time, and say you're talking through, maybe you're working on a comprehension strategy, let's say cause and effect. We want to understand, why did this happen to the character in the story? This is a cause and effect type of a comprehension strategy. You would read your passage, discuss it, and then have students turn and talk, have them say it. You're always listening. And then have them come back and kind of share it out. So anytime we can make it more collaborative and cooperative, it just makes them, learning is more fun that way. And I think it really does help students build agency around their own education. And of course, it does improve content, knowledge and understanding, and English language acquisition. And then graphics, similar to pictures, you see this a lot. We use graphic organizers a lot. Basically, let's put our information into a visual that students can understand. It might look like a chart. It might be a timeline. We see the hundreds chart a lot in the elementary grades, using graphs to help students express and process their learning and their language. And when we're using all of these types of scaffolds, we are just pouring on as much academic language as we can. And we're modeling it for them. We need to model it. In my early years of teaching, I taught really young students. I taught kindergarten, and then I moved up to second, and then I moved to first grade. And what happens is, I hadn't been as formally trained yet in the importance of academic language, even at 5, 6, 7 years old. And so when you're working with, small students, or, younger students, you kind of begin to speak like them in a way. So in retrospect, I would accept more simplistic answers like tummy. When I'm like, I really said, oh, you mean your stomach? No, tummy is cute. Who doesn't like to hear a little 5-year-old talk about their tummy, right? It's sweet. But really, had I known more and had more experience, I'd say, oh, do you mean your stomach? You were patting your stomach, and really modeling that academic language. It's so important because our English learners, in most cases, they don't have a whole lot of exposure to formal academic English language at home. They're learning their home language, which is amazing and wonderful. And we want them to continue to build their fluency and their proficiency in their home language. But having those academic English language models, that is really a core part of our work in education around supporting our emergent bilingual students.
Cecilia, just a quick time
Yes.
check. It's 1:40 right now. So
Okay.
just wanted to let you know we're all good, but just wanted to let you know where we were.
All right. Well, I am not going to read every one of these, but I'll give you an example, because Ingrid, I'm just assuming you'll share this presentation out to everybody. But going back to those 6 stages, here's some really specific things you can do while you're working with your students. For example, if you have a student that's still in that silent period, that pre-production stage, you would do a lot of modeling, like I said, a lot of gesturing, pointing. When it comes to correcting grammar, correcting English, you have to be a little bit careful, because we don't want to reinforce, certain language that might hold them up. And at the same time, remember, we have to be aware of that student's comfort level learning a new language. If I were to go to another country where I have no idea what the language is, and the minute I attempted, I built up the courage to say it, and then if I were to get corrected, I probably wouldn't want to speak it anymore. So in this pre-production, we really don't want to overemphasize the error correction. You're really wanting them just to start to come out of their shell and use the language. And it doesn't matter if they make the mistakes. We don't expect them to say things perfectly in their early stages of language development. So you can reinforce, if a student said ball and maybe pointed to it, then you could say, okay, great. Do you want the ball? Would you like me to get the ball for you? So you're not correcting them, but you're modeling how they would, say it if they were to the level yet to speak in full sentences. Early production, similar. We really want to avoid those excessive error corrections, but just reinforce by modeling. In early production, when you're working with students, you're asking more kind of yes or no questions. They're not quite ready to answer open-ended questions. Whereas in the next level, in speech emergent, they are ready. They're to use a little bit more language. So that's when you would try and amp up a little bit in that academic vocabulary. Ideally, they're in a state where they're more confident speaking English. They have more vocabulary. They've had more time to practice. So you still want to model, but in the speech emergence stage, you kind of have to choose when you're going to correct and when you're not. If it's going to affect the meaning of something they want to say or something they're reading, those are kind of the corrections you want to focus on, so that it doesn't interfere with the meaning of something. But otherwise, just continue to model the correct language. It should never be punitive. It's not a good practice in any field of education, but especially when a student is learning English, it's being punitive around, overcorrecting in grammar and all that. It's like, if I understand what you say, that's pretty good. And eventually you will get there when you're speaking in these complete sentences and paragraphs and composing poetry. It does happen, and it's an amazing thing to watch happen. The last 3 slides, I'll kind of leave you to look at these on your own time, because I know we're running out of time. But this is broken into that beginning, intermediate, and advanced fluency. This is when students, we should be encouraging them to speak in complete sentences. We can correct them if there's some syntactical errors. This is where it's like, okay, it's time now. We want to make sure that they're saying things properly and correctly. Pronunciation is a big one. Don't over focus on pronunciation. That can be another kind of area that inhibits. There's plenty of fluent English speakers that spoke or their first language is not English, and they have an accent, and that's totally okay. Accents are beautiful things, right? If it doesn't confuse the meaning, we don't want to over correct a pronunciation. Same thing with intermediate influencies. This is when you can basically, students are a little more active in their learning in that point. So in a reading passage, we always encourage volunteers, if you're working with a student and they don't understand a word, don't tell them what it means right away. Maybe have them jot it down, put it on a sticky note. If it's a copy they can write on, they can circle it, and then talk about, what do you think that word means? Is there, and what would make sense in this sentence, rather than just giving them the answer. We call it productive struggle, and it's super important. We need them to do that work. It's really like this meta-linguistic work that they're doing in their minds to negotiate language and to kind of come to the answer on their own. Because we're not always there right next to them, and they may be in settings where they're not going to have a scaffold available. So we want to support them, but they need to work a little bit sometimes. And sometimes out of the kindness of our hearts, we want to give them the answer. But it's more about the process of getting to the answer, not necessarily the end product. The process is what we really need to cultivate in our students. And then here's a few examples for advanced fluency that you might want to try with your students. All right, I spoke really fast. I do that. I know I do that. But I wanted to give you all, kind of a common background and understanding before we jumped right into specific strategies. So that said, are there any questions or comments or clarification that I can offer?
Cecilia, I have a question. If you know a little bit of the language, that the student's native language, is it helpful to translate for them a little bit, or should you try and explain, if you're trying to define a word, should you define it in English to get them to work at it, or should you kind of use, in Spanish, it would be this?
Yeah. So I think it's totally fine. If you are fortunate enough to speak a second language that's the first language of a student, I think it's absolutely fine to support them, especially in a volunteer setting. Now, my answer would be different if it was a classroom teacher, just because they're with students for hours and hours, day after day. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer, but honestly, if you can support them and leverage that first language, especially if then there's early stages, I would not discourage it at all. I think it also uplifts and validates that home language, because we want to recognize that that is an asset that a student brings to us. And sometimes it's good for students and a little entertaining for them too, to see grown-ups struggle a little bit with a second language, right? So I would say, yes, utilize that second language. Now, if the student, though, is wanting to do everything in Spanish, say, then you might be like, yeah, no, I can say this, but right now we're going to move into English. Let's practice our English. So it's a fine line, but if you have the gift of speaking that second language that's the same as your student's home language, utilize it.
Thank you.
Jillian, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much for this, Celia. It's great. Can you come back every week? That would be nice.
Yeah.
Uh, do you have any tips that you could give us about having children respond in full sentences and when they should be able to start to do that? When they sound like they're pretty proficient in English, but you say, now my kids, these are first grade kids.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
say, what was this book about? Ball.
Yep.
How can I get them to elongate that and to think in sentences, or is it too soon to be thinking about doing that?
I don't think it's too soon. As a matter of fact, and I know what school Jillian is at because we worked together for many years. That was kind of a school-wide thing we did for a long time, where a student, we would ask a question, pose a question, and we might get a single word response. Now, if it's a newcomer, you probably wouldn't get a single word, you might, right? But if you know what you said, Jillian, if the student has enough conversational skills, they could and should be able to speak in a complete sentence. And we would just say, can you answer that in a complete sentence? And sometimes they need a sentence frame, right? You need to kind of give them the language. Can you say, I like that book because, or that book was about a ball? You can give them that language. That's a scaffold, but it is good for them if they're at that level, that kind of the beginning fluency level, which is kind of what you're describing, Jillian. I would absolutely, reinforce the importance of them using complete sentences.
Hi, can I ask a question? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. This was awesome. So I work with second graders and I'm going to have I have a couple that are bilingual, but I'm going to get a new student next week who is newcomer, just arrived yesterday. So you talk about the second level, the transitional words as being the key. How do you model a transition word without using Spanish, without me going to my Google Translate or using my whatever Spanish from college? How do you model, the transition words, which are the key to
the tier 2 words?
Yeah.
So for that situation, a newcomer, your focus shouldn't be on tier 2 words. They're not.
I have other kids besides. I have kids that are.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking specifically.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I have a range. I have a range of kids. I'm sorry. I wasn't clear. Yeah.
And well, I guess it would just, for me, the answer would depend on what's the activity that you're working on with them. So for example, I'm second grade, right? So they're
Right.
still probably in leveled readers. Maybe some of them are moving into some early chapter books. If you're doing that kind of reading with them, or that if they're doing a writing assignment, I would point out some of those words. A lot of those tier 2 words are kind of at the start of a sentence, because it's how an author, when they're crafting their writing, it's how an author introduces or launches an idea or a thought. So those are the kind of words I would, if they're reading it fluently, you can always say, what did you just read? Can you tell me what you just read? And then they should be able to say it. If they don't, then look at the sentence and see, is there a word there that might be tripping them up? Could it be a word like frequently? That could trip up a student if they don't know what it means, and especially an English learner, that could completely change the meaning of a word. So there's no really black or white answer on that one,
Okay.
because it's going to be dependent on the activity you're doing. But I would say if the student is at that kind of that fluency level and it's kind of interfering their meaning, it could be because of the tier 2 vocabulary that they haven't quite mastered yet. So you almost have to preview what you're going to be reading with them, or as they're reading, have it in your mind. Is there a word in there throughout? That's a word too. So like, or through, beyond, those kind of words, they're pretty abstract, but it
Right.
change the meaning if you're reading something, right? Like the child, we're talking about balls today. So the child threw the ball beyond the fence. If you don't know what beyond means and there's not a picture there, a student might, oh, what did you just read? The student threw the ball. Where did they throw the ball? Beyond the fence? What does that mean? And if they're quiet, do you know beyond means past, maybe over the fence? That's what I mean. You have to explicitly teach that language.
Okay. I have to really think about that one. Yes. Okay.
It's a lot. And just
Yeah.
as a native English speaker, it's just we hear this from birth. We're hearing these language, these sentence patterns when family members are talking, our peers are talking in just English. We're in a monolingual brain, but the students, if you're working with English learners, you're working with, a dual language brain or a multilingual brain. And there's a lot of stuff firing in that brain, right? So, things like the example beyond, for example, are just words we just know what it means. We don't remember how we learned it. We just know what it means because we've always heard it.
We've heard it. Right.
Context, and we've heard it used in context.
And most of my kids don't get support at home. They speak Spanish at home.
Right.
And on the playground, they're speaking Spanish too. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So yeah, I've got one question in the chat that just popped up. Let me read that to you.
Yep.
It says, is it a good strategy to chat with the student to learn what they like to do, hobbies, etc., and utilize this info to help in the process of learning?
Absolutely 100%. I mean, we just spent over an hour, almost an hour talking about, language development, but first and foremost comes that human connection, building that relationship, getting to know the child. So that is absolutely a go-to strategy, I think, for all things in life, right? Know the people around you, understand kind of what makes them tick, maybe things that might cause a different response you might not like with them. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you are little champions for these, or you're champions for these little ones that we serve, right? And the more you know them, the more you know them as a person, the more you'll get to know them as a learner. And that's when you'll be able to better support their learning.
Another question that came up in the chat says, when you talk about not correcting, do you mean allow the student to practice fluency without interrupting, or do you mean, for example, not correcting an actual mistake?
I think, again, it's kind of going back to where is this student in terms of that continuum of language development. So early on, we don't want to stifle a student from producing language by overcorrecting grammar. If it is affecting the meaning, or if they're at a level where they should be able to, then that's when you kind of intercede and you model how to say it correctly. We don't want to reinforce bad habits. We don't want to, reinforce the wrong answer by any means. But we also don't want to stifle it. Again, this kind of goes back to that last comment, knowing your student and where they're at. Do they have a comfort level where they can kind of take that risk with you, and they know, oh, if Miss Debbie or Miss Jillian or Miss Sandra, if they're correcting me, it's because they really care about me and they want me to know it. Whereas if they maybe don't know them as well, or you're just now working with a student, they might not know that you're doing it right to really support them. They might be like, oh, I'm doing it wrong. I'm not going to try it anymore. So again, a lot of these answers, there's kind of the head part of it that we understand acquisition, and then there's the heart of it. You know your kiddos, and you know what's going to be the right move I make at this time, kind of given where they're at.
Yeah.
It looks like Jean has her hand up. Jean Gunn, would you like to take yourself off of mute and ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. This has been really enlightening. Really appreciate it. I'm working with third graders, and I'm not really. I suspect this is not their first language. However, English is not their first language, but they both seem very fluent to me. But anyway, the question I have is, we work with flashcards, and they will make up a sentence that's part of our drill. We do more fun things too. But my question is, we came across the word there, THERE. Is third grade, should I be going into their THEIR and their THEY''RE? Because when they use it in a sentence, they'll say, the word will be THERE, and they'll say their parents are going to the movies. So I don't want to put too much on them, but
Yeah. That, oh my goodness, I taught second grade for a long time, and the there, and the two, oh my goodness. So my first thought was like, honestly, my first thought was like, check with the teacher to see what they've taught already and kind of where they are in that. But at the same time, they will eventually get that, to be totally honest with you. They'll eventually learn those rules. Developmentally at a third grade, it's completely normal for them to say, like you said, they're at the park and maybe they spell it THERE. Okay. And that's okay. You understand what they want to say. I mean, you could say, you know, there's actually 3 different versions of there, and you can go through and explain it if you have the time to do that. But it's kind of like letter reversals. For example, a B and a D, right? Developmentally, students can be doing that up to like 9 or 10, and it's really not a cause for alarm. And I know that seems like, wait, what? But it's normal. Developmentally,
Right.
it's okay. Eventually they will understand the difference.
Terrific.
So there again, you know, I feel like I'm trying to give answers, but it kind of depends on that student, that moment in time. Do you have the time to do it? Is that something the teachers, usually that's having taught for many years, usually that's actually an explicit lesson that's taught. You're talking about those homophones, right? And how they're spelled differently than what they actually mean. So you might want to check with the teacher. You might want to just let it slide if it's not interfering with the meeting. And you might want to just take a moment and say, you know, there's actually another way to spell that to say what you want to say.